Había un chico que directamente hablaba de que ese móvil le daba estatus.
There's a huge amount of inequality in our societies, and this promise that if you have the right clothes, you will not be treated like garbage, I think is a very powerful one. And it isn't about saying, well, to me, it should not be about passing judgment on the kid who believes that they will be treated with dignity if they look the right way. It's about deconstructing that and trying to build a fairer society where everybody is treated fairly.
Tanto tú como yo nos podemos permitir, sin muchos problemas, comprarnos un iPhone 7. Yo no sé quién es más vulnerable al consumismo, el que se lo puede permitir o el que lo ve como un objeto de deseo prácticamente inalcanzable.
There's certainly people who can't afford it, for whom the promise of the iPhone or a new pair of running shoes is more intense than people who are already in that class, kind of to escape to another class, to be, like, as they said, on the go. And so I think the phone increasingly is this promise of total mobility and freedom. It's a portal. It's a portal for some people to another class. It's a portal. It's going to take you out of where you are. You're not happy where you are. That's why you need this thing that's going to get you out.
¿De qué manera podemos combatir esa atracción que provocan en nosotros las grandes marcas? ¿Cómo podemos huir de eso?
I have a particular view of this because I divide my time between living in the country and living in the city. I've spent about half my life living in a very rural part of Canada, in British Columbia, where there's nothing to buy, there's no advertisements, and I'm so acutely aware of how I change when I go from that setting to a city where I'm bombarded with messages telling me to buy, telling me I'm not good enough.
Pues ya tenemos la solución, nos vamos a vivir todos al campo y se acabó el consumismo.
I don't mean that. I mean that is what has helped me become conscious of it. But I think we all can do that. I mean we all have to be interrogating ourselves of, where is this need coming from that I feel right now? It is not self-generated. It is external.
En tu primer bestseller, en No Logo, tú ya hablabas del poder de las marcas. De este libro ya han pasado 16 años.
Yeah.
Yo no sé si estamos mejor.
It's interesting. Somebody did a piece here in Toronto for a local newspaper. Went to a local university and asked incoming students about their attitudes about brands, and they found that they were very against wearing logos. So some things have changed, but I think overall the biggest difference is that when I finished writing No Logo, the book sort of ends with this sort of crazy idea that people would start to think of themselves as their own brand, right? That this brand, the brand called you. And so now, 16 years later, I would say that the most significant difference is that we now have a generation who has grown up entirely immersed in this idea that they are themselves a brand, that they must market constantly, right? And that's why the iPhone, or whatever the smartphone is that you use, Samsung or whatever, is your primary tool as a young person to create your own brand. That's the tool you're going to use to take pictures of yourself and update your social media profiles constantly to broadcast the brand called you.
Nos hemos fijado en la portada de tu último libro, Esto lo cambia todo, su edición española. Hemos visto que el título del libro está más pequeño que el nombre de Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein, hasta Naomi Klein se ha convertido en una marca.
It's funny that is the title, that's the design chosen for the Spanish edition, because for the English edition, the cover of the book doesn't have my name at all. Yeah.
¿Qué me dices?
It says, this changes everything, and my name doesn't appear anywhere on the cover, which was a debate.
Entonces, ¿qué te parece? Que en la edición española sí que aparezca tu nombre y además en estas dimensiones.
There's only so much that I can control or really have the energy to try to control because I want to do the work. Now, my publishers put various covers on my books and send them to me. And to be honest with you, I spend about 5 seconds on it. I'm just like, unless it's terrible, I'm just like, okay, it's fine.
Naomi, ¿tú eres un antisistema?
Am I an anti-system? I don't know what that means. What is an anti-system?
Bueno, antisistema es ir contra el sistema que tenemos actualmente.
Yes, I'm anti-capitalist. I believe we have an economic and political system that is failing us on multiple levels, and including the most important level of all, which is whether this system is at war with the planetary systems that support life.
En España, cuando un partido político se define como antisistema, normalmente se le desprestigia, incluso se le ridiculiza. ¿A ti también te pasa?
Well, look, I think there's a moment now where it's actually a majority position to be anti-system, right? On the left and the right, right? And this is why it's...
¿Sí?
Well, if you look, for instance, at the U.S. presidential elections, right? The people who are supporting Donald Trump are anti-system. I mean, that's the discourse that he is using. They're against the system. The people who voted for Brexit in the UK were rejecting that system. And I think really since the economic collapse in 2008-9, right? The failures of that system, of our economic system, are so clear. Privatizing and deregulating and cutting social spending, that model has failed. There's a race on about who's going to fill that vacuum. Is it going to be a progressive alternative with a vision for how you change that system so that it improves life for the many and protects the planet? Or is it going to be filled by an anti-system, right-wing populism or even fascism that blames the failures of the system on black and brown people and creates a far more divided and violent society? Many of the people who pose as anti-system on the right are in fact very much a part of that system, and of course the huge, contradictory nature of Donald Trump. The fact that he is a part of the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, and he is running a campaign claiming he's going to take down the system and fight for the little guy who lost his jobs to the Mexican and so on. I mean, obviously, I don't consider that to be a genuinely anti-system party or candidate, but they're tapping into a genuine anti-system feeling in the population.
Cuando se empezó a hablar de la globalización en los años 90, era como un término que molaba, que era guapo. Creo que hoy día, si tú preguntas por la globalización, no todo el mundo opinará eso. ¿Qué ha pasado?
Reality. Reality asserts itself. When we started talking about these free trade deals in the 90s, we were largely having a debate between people who were saying, no, this is going to push down wages, and then other people saying, no, it's going to make everybody rich and it is going to help everybody. Now we have a track record. Now we have a couple of decades to measure the promise of these policies against the lived reality of those policies. The reality is complicated. But we certainly know that where these policies are introduced, inequality absolutely widens.
Hace casi un año fuimos a Camboya y hablamos con mujeres que cosían ropa para grandes marcas. Y nos sorprendió esta respuesta que nos dieron. En mi país hay muchas chicas de vuestra edad y chicos que, bueno, no tienen muchas dificultades para comprarse un jersey como este. ¿Cómo le explicaríais lo que hay detrás de este jersey? Todo el trabajo que hay y a veces también el sufrimiento que puede haber detrás de un jersey.
When I asked workers in Indonesia and the Philippines these questions about what consumers can do, they didn't even really understand the question because they don't see their power as consumers. They don't have very much consumer power. And a lot of the union organizers who were very angry at these American companies would wear T-shirts with like Disney on it or like, some of the logos. And I asked them about it. Like, well, why do you wear that, And they said, they were like, well, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter what we wear or, it matters what we do. Like, it matters how we organize. They'd have lunch at McDonald's because they thought the idea that politics through consumption was like such a bourgeois notion to them that's not your sphere of political influence. Your sphere of political influence is organizing a union, having a strike, having a protest, and asking for a raise.
En tu segundo libro, tú defendías que el capitalismo salvaje se había impuesto gracias a lo que tú llamabas la doctrina del shock. ¿A qué te refieres cuando hablas del shock?
What I mean by shocks is just moments of when history moves into fast forward, when something happens for which we have no story, no ability to metabolize it because it seems to come out of the blue. It is precisely in these moments of discombobulation, of mass confusion, of shock, when there has been a strategy to push through these very unpopular policies. And it's not a conspiracy that, I'm not saying, well, they created the shock so that they could do it. In many cases, these are entirely unexpected and unplanned. It could even be a natural disaster like a tsunami or Hurricane Katrina. But there is the understanding that this is the moment to pounce. This is the moment to act. That's when you're going to be able to privatize, the water and the electricity and the phones and so on through a rapid fire actions that they called at the time. It's fallen out of fashion. They don't use the word anymore, but they used to call it shock therapy.
¿De dónde sale, de dónde surge esa idea de aprovechar una crisis, aprovechar un shock para introducir cambios que le hacen más difícil a veces la vida a la gente?
Well, I think a lot of it just came from frustration in realizing how hard it is to implement these policies without a crisis, without a shock in a democracy. So, for instance, Milton Friedman in the United States, he tried to advise Nixon, and Milton Friedman was furious because even though this was supposed to be, a right-wing government, Nixon refused to follow his advice. He ended up doing the opposite. In order to win an election, he brought in wage and price controls. He introduced a series of very strong environmental regulations, and I actually think that's the real root. was realizing that democracy is a problem for neoliberalism.
¿Por qué el miedo es una herramienta tan potente para el poder?
If your ideas are unpopular and indeed harmful for the majority of the population, there has to be a strategy to push them through anyway. And when you are in a democracy, moments of crisis, moments of severe economic crisis, create situations where you can be much more authoritarian than usual, because you are able to hide behind crisis.
¿Qué papel jugamos los medios de comunicación cuando hay un proceso de shock impuesto desde la élite?
Well, it's crucial, and you know, and ideally, the role of the media would be to help people not panic, right? I mean, this is why it's so important during. If you think about like during a natural disaster, right, the role of the media is so important to just get information so that people can be as calm as they can, so that things can function as well as it possibly can. But what you find during economic crises is often the opposite. They fuel hysteria. They make people more disoriented and more frightened. And you know, I see that as a real betrayal of the role. And you know, ideally, we would be getting reoriented through information, through people who are in the information business. And instead, what we often get is really betrayed by the people who should be helping us get back on our feet intellectually in these moments of shock.
Tú conoces lo que pasó en España en el año 2011, el 15M, que sacó muchísima gente a la calle pidiendo pues un cambio, pidiendo algo diferente y también defendiendo aquello que se empezaba a recortar, que era la educación y la sanidad pública. Hubo profesores que salieron a la calle, también médicos, personal sanitario, pero 5 años después encontramos a muchos de estos profesionales agotados.
Aquí hay muchos despachos que nadie sabe lo que hacen y está cobrando el sueldo en su casa. Esa es la idea, es que había que medir a todos.
Bueno, la reacción en el año 2010 fue una reacción maravillosa y magnífica porque todos los colectivos y parte de la ciudadanía reaccionó rápidamente contra las movilizaciones.
Una vez a la semana venían los vecinos y se cortaba la autovía que está aquí delante.
¿Qué os pasa? ¿De qué os quejáis?
Bueno, nos quejamos de los recortes.
Los recortes, así en general.
En este hospital han cerrado 300 camas, la mitad de los quirófanos, la mitad de las camas de intensivos. Llevamos así todo el verano. Bueno, ahora tampoco podemos absorber la demanda. Cataluña ha perdido un 14% del presupuesto de sanidad, que son unos 1.400 millones de euros. Este dinero lo necesitamos para poder atender bien a la población. Han aumentado las listas de espera, se han intentado maquillar, pero las listas de espera están ahí.
La administración es como una rueda de molino que va girando, 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 girando. Si es cierto que la podemos frenar, incluso la podemos llegar a parar, pero la rueda seguirá girando y arrastra siempre a todo el que se pone por delante.
A finales del 2012, la Consejería de Sanidad de Madrid sacó una propuesta de un plan privatizar los 6 hospitales nuevos que había construido Esperanza Aguirre en el 2007-2008 y bueno, se convocó una huelga indefinida que duró 5 semanas. El actual gobierno de la Comunidad de Madrid sigue manteniendo las mismas líneas de actuación, los mismos principios básicos y solamente no los consigue llevar a cabo porque no tiene la mayoría absoluta que ha tenido durante muchísimos años, que les ha permitido legislar sin ninguna oposición. Pero vamos, su modus operandi yo creo que no se ha modificado.
Fue un shock, o sea, nos quedamos perplejos de cómo en poco tiempo pasó lo que pasó.
Y de repente te dicen hay que cerrar medio hospital y no sabíamos cómo atender a los pacientes. Yo he visto aquí enfermeras llorando de impotencia, enfermeras de las mayores, de las que llevaban años, diciendo esto yo no lo aguanto.
Gana el Barça y todo el mundo, venga, venga, y esto que es de todos, nos quedemos ahí sentados. Eso sí que es una vergüenza, una vergüenza.
¿Usted cree que no está habiendo suficiente protesta por todo lo que se está recortando?
No, porque teníamos que salir a manifestarnos nosotros. Ellos luchan por nosotros, están aquí para ayudarnos y luego nosotros nos quedamos sentaditos. Eso sí que es una vergüenza.
Uno no puede estar todo el día con la pancarta en la calle, porque uno tiene otras cosas que hacer en su vida aparte de estar con la pancarta en la calle.
Yo diría que estamos por una parte, muy cansados, porque sobre nuestras espaldas han puesto, digamos, el mantenimiento de la asistencia a los pacientes. Y esto, un día tras otro, cansa mucho. Y como vamos muy apretados de trabajo, y eso no nos falta, tener que salir cuando hemos salido muchas veces ya.
¿O tú crees que tú podrías estar 4 años manifestándote todos los días en la calle, 2 veces por semana, todos los domingos?
Yo creo que los médicos que son más jóvenes, yo creo que se adaptan mucho más a las nuevas circunstancias que los que somos un poco más veteranos. Pero con esto no quiero decir que sean conformistas, es lo que hay. Yo hago la residencia, yo acabo, yo soy médico y voy haciendo. ¿Qué hay esto? Pues hay esto. Pero tenemos miedo al futuro, tenemos mucho miedo al futuro.
Vendrán más crisis y yo no sé cómo cuando vengan esas otras crisis podemos evitar como ciudadanos que nos cuelen los recortes que nos colaron en esta crisis.
You have to have an alternative strategy for getting to the roots of the crisis. There has to be a credible alternative to the shock doctrine that is more than just don't do it. So the idea that we can just organize ourselves and say, no, 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 stop, stop, stop. People are exhausted by that in Europe. They've been saying no for years. They have organized, they've occupied squares. They've, organized solidarity clinics. They're exhausted by only resisting. It can't only be defensive. It has to be offensive as well. So there has to be a political vision and a political project that is building the alternative. I think it has to be transnational. It can't only be country by country. And it has to be a vision that is solving multiple problems, is a vision for solving multiple problems at once, right? Because yes, there is an economic crisis, but there is also an ecological crisis. There's also a humanitarian crisis. So I think that the real task is designing and then implementing first locally these alternatives that really get at the root causes of multiple problems, and then people will start to build confidence. I had a meeting with Tsipras before he was elected, and I said, I told him what I'm telling you. And he said to me very clearly, he said, I disagree. This is the moment for the no. And, he ended up being right. He was elected. But I still believe that that ultimately it's not going to be successful unless the alternative to this system appears not just credible, but inspiring and exciting. The problem is the no is not enough. It has to be there also has to be a yes, and there has to be confidence in that yes.
En tu último libro, Esto lo cambia todo, dices que este sistema basado en crecer, producir y consumir se va a tener que acabar por el cambio climático. No podemos seguir creciendo.
So, we have an economic model that sees any kind of economic growth as an asset, and including extremely polluting economic growth. It doesn't distinguish. That model is entirely incompatible with the kind of cuts that we need to make to prevent catastrophic climate change. In countries like Canada, Spain, we need to be cutting our emissions by 10% a year. That is huge. There is nothing on the table that is close to that. It isn't possible to do it within a system that fetishizes the market, that fetishizes growth. It means that there are parts where, of our lives that are all about consumption and waste, and we do need to contract those parts of our lives. But at the same time, we can expand and grow those parts of our economy that are that are low carbon and improve quality of life, and that's going to make it a lot easier if we do that.
¿Por qué dices que luchando contra el cambio climático también podemos conseguir un cambio de sistema?
What we have seen now is 25 years of policies trying to deal with climate change without changing the system, to trying to fit the problem of climate change within our existing market system. So carbon trading, setting a market up for pollution, encouraging people to buy green products instead of not green products, or addressing people primarily as consumers. And the fact is these policies have failed. I mean, the European emission trading system is a boondoggle. Emissions around the world are up by 60%. And this is because our current system stands in the way. It's clear to me that it requires system change in order to deliver these kinds of emission reductions. The good news is that this system is failing us on many, many levels other than climate change. So now we have an opportunity, as we change our energy grids, as we change our transportation systems, to build a fair economy at the same time. So my obsession of the past, 6 years now has been to try to bring these movements together, right? Because you have the people who are fighting austerity or fighting against trade deals, fighting inequality in one corner, and then you have the people who are focused on climate change and environment in another. They don't talk to each other very much. They're really separate movements, and it needs to be the same movement and the same process, and we need these solutions that address inequality and climate change at the same time.
En los últimos años hemos visto cómo multinacionales están intentando dar una imagen de que la manera que tienen de producir es sostenible, o que, por ejemplo, están fabricando ya coches eléctricos. ¿El mercado está preocupado por el cambio climático?
So I think we need to make a distinction between whether the market is going to fix the problem of climate change and whether or not there's a role for markets as we deal with the problem, right? And I think the latter is true. I think there is a role for markets and a role for companies making, electric vehicles, and they'll make money doing it. I have no problem with that. But I think if we then conclude that just because, Elon Musk is going to get very rich selling Teslas, therefore capitalism can solve climate change, that's insane, because those are incredibly expensive cars. There's, and the real task is massive investments in public transit so that everybody can use it. And the market has no interest in providing affordable or even free public transit so that people don't have to use cars. And that's going to be the solution for many, many more numbers of people.
Julio se ha convertido en el mes más cálido de la historia, no solo en España, sino en todo el mundo. El más caluroso en 136 años, con un aumento de la temperatura media de casi 1 grado. Una secuencia directa: la masa helada en el Ártico marca un mínimo histórico. Y mientras, España aumenta las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero en el último año un 3,5% más que en 2014.
Tú dices que deberíamos dejar de extraer petróleo desde ya. ¿Eso no es muy radical? Y sobre todo, ¿es posible teniendo el sistema de vida que tenemos actualmente?
The science on this is very clear. If we want to do what we said we're going to do in Paris at the last climate change conference, if we want to keep temperatures below 1.5 to 2 degrees, then we cannot explore for more oil and gas and coal. The fossil fuels that we currently have in production, if we used it all up, we would blow our temperature target. So that doesn't mean we stop tomorrow. It means we need a plan to wind down and get to 100% renewables by mid-century. And it is possible to do that with existing technology. It is radical, I admit, but the future is radical.
Dices que se va a necesitar mucho dinero para frenar el cambio climático. ¿Quién lo va a pagar?
I'm glad you asked, actually. I think a lot of the money has to come from the people who are most responsible for this. And this is why it is really important that we now have a lot of new information about what the oil companies knew and when they knew it. It's similar to what happened with the tobacco companies. So the easiest thing we do is we eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, because right now we're paying these companies to pollute, giving them huge amounts of subsidies. We also need a strong carbon tax, but it has to be designed in a way that does not pass the cost on to low-income consumers. It has to be progressive. We have to increase royalties on extraction. We can have a luxury tax so that we know that the people who are wealthiest in our economy pollute the most, emit the most, and should pay the most for this transition. So, look, I've said tax a lot, and I've been very honest that it is going to take redistributive policies and it is going to take a challenge to the neoliberal logic, but the money is there. We live in a time of unprecedented private wealth, and we have to get a much larger share of that wealth to pay for the damage and the transition.
¿Qué países están tomando en serio la lucha contra el cambio climático?
Well, I mean, interestingly, China is taking it more seriously than almost any country right now. They've placed a moratorium on new coal mines, and they are rolling out renewable energy with incredible speed. And this is happening because the air pollution in China is such a crisis. And Germany is doing a lot. They're now getting 30% of their energy from renewables.
¿Y España?
Spain, yeah. So Spain is, to me, it's one of the very strongest examples of how the logic of austerity is an attack both on people and the planet.
Esto es un huerto solar formado por una cooperativa de propietarios, y estos propietarios son los vecinos de las poblaciones que rodean al huerto. Somos una empresa de origen austriaco que en el 2009 desembarcó en España porque era un buen momento para poder desarrollarnos, ¿no?, como empresa y como fabricante de inversores fotovoltaicos. Un inversor fotovoltaico es un aparato que lo que hace es transformar la electricidad que generan las placas para poder ser utilizada en nuestras viviendas. En los años 2006, 2007, 2008 hubo una voluntad política para favorecer este tipo de tecnologías en nuestro país. Elegimos España porque vimos un potencial importante, dado a que España era el líder indiscutible en el mercado fotovoltaico a nivel mundial. No había habido nunca otro país en el mundo con un desarrollo tan grande de la energía solar fotovoltaica, de la potencia instalada en un país. Muchas empresas que venían de fuera se encontraron un caldo de cultivo para ampliar sus conocimientos.
Think about what's happening in countries like Spain, Germany, and Japan, where they're making real investments in renewable energy. They're surging ahead of us, poised to take the lead in this new industry. This isn't because they're smarter than us, or work harder than us, or are more innovative than we are. It's because their governments have harnessed their people's hard work and ingenuity with bold investments.
Los primeros recortes a la producción fotovoltaica empezaron en el 2010. La legislatura pertenecía al PSOE y luego el PP, cuando salió en el gobierno en el 2011, en diciembre del 2011, la primera ley de la legislatura fue una ley que decía que se acababan las primas a las energías renovables, se acababan las primas a la energía solar fotovoltaica Y ahí pues realmente pues, hubo un cierto pavor en un inicio porque no sabíamos hacia dónde íbamos a ir. Estábamos totalmente perdidos. Obviamente, las empresas que viven del mercado fotovoltaico, en ese momento pues le tiemblan los cimientos. Muchas de ellas no han podido soportar esta bajada en el mercado fotovoltaico y han desaparecido. Éramos 150.000 personas. Actualmente no llegamos a 5.000 personas. En nuestro caso, por ejemplo, pues pasamos de estar facturando en torno a unos 20 millones de euros en el 2008 a estar facturando pues en torno a un 80 y tantos % menos de aquel entonces. Se están poniendo impuestos a la generación de la energía solar fotovoltaica, a lo que tú consumes, a lo que se te escapa a la red. Si quieres acumular en una pequeña batería en tu vivienda, también tienes que pagar un impuesto. Eso no sucede en ningún país del mundo desarrollado. Portugal tiene una normativa que apoya definitivamente el autoconsumo. Francia la tiene, México la tiene, Estados Unidos en la mayoría de los estados la tienen. No hablemos ya de Centro Europa, Alemania, Italia, Austria. No dependen de otros recursos externos a sus países. El sol lo tienen en el propio país, porque voy a tener que comprar petróleo o carbón de otros países cuando yo tengo la materia prima en mi país. Se da la circunstancia de que el Reino Unido en el 2015 instaló 3.500 megavatios de energía solar fotovoltaica sin tener sol, entre comillas, ¿no? Nosotros, teniendo ese sol, sin embargo, instalamos 49 megavatios. Claro, mis compañeros austriacos no lo entienden. Han pasado a ver España como uno de los países con mayor potencial en energía solar fotovoltaica a ser uno de sus objetivos más pequeñitos.
¿Te sorprendió el ejemplo de España? Que al principio apostó por esas energías alternativas y luego con las medidas anticrisis desaparecieron esas inversiones.
Yeah, I was surprised about the sun tax. I mean, just how explicit that it isn't just that Spain is not. It didn't just stop helping. It's actively discouraging its citizens from doing what they should be doing, which is putting up solar panels. It's penalizing them for doing the right thing.
Todos somos responsables del desastre climático.
We are all in the system that is producing the climate crisis, but we're not all equally responsible for this crisis. And I actually think that this idea that, you know, kind of we've met the enemy and it is us, like we all did this, is really benefits the oil companies and the coal companies that have fought very hard over the years to prevent governments from taking sensible actions that would have allowed us to shift to renewable energy long ago. And a lot of people are in situations where they don't have any good options. You know, they live in places without public transit, so they have to drive. They don't live in places where there are charging stations, so even if they could afford an electric vehicle, they don't know how to, they don't have the ability to charge those vehicles. But you can be part of that system and at the same time want to change that system.
¿Va a ser esta la última generación de la abundancia?
I think we're the last generation of carelessness, of being able to imagine that that there were no limits to how much we could take from the earth. So so I think that it is the end of imagining that we can be careless with the earth systems that sustain life.
¿Somos conscientes de que se están acabando los recursos naturales?
I don't think there is a we. I don't think there is one we to answer that question, because I think there are parts of this planet that have really hit the wall of water, let alone oil. And they're living with extreme water scarcity right now. So they absolutely understand limits. And the dangerous thing about fossil fuels is that we haven't run out. It's not the limits of what we can extract from the earth, it's the limits of what our atmosphere can absorb. So this requires a kind of restraint, right? I mean, when you fish out all the fish and there's no more fish, you can't fish anymore, right? But with fossil fuels, the problem is there is a lot more carbon in the earth than we can afford to burn. And that is why it is a problem of regulation and a problem of greed and a problem of restraint, because we have to leave it in the ground. And that is something we are extremely bad at in a capitalist system, is leaving things that are still profitable where they are.
Tus diagnósticos muchas veces son pesimistas, pero en cambio siempre dejas abierta una puerta a la esperanza. No sé cómo lo haces.
The reason why I don't give in to despair is simply that I know that if I can no longer see any pathway for hope, I probably won't write books and give speeches anymore, because I don't really see a point of spreading hopelessness. I would try to make space for other people who are still hopeful. One thing I really don't like are people who go around just spreading hopelessness, because it's contagious. I think you should self-quarantine when you get to that point.